I never really believed the creepy stories about the Appalachian Mountains when I was growing up. Especially if you spend your childhood in a small town like mine, right on the edge of Pisgah National Forest. People talk about strange lights, weird sounds in the woods, creatures they swear aren't animals, but I always figured it was just something folks said to make life feel less ordinary. At 30, I can admit I was wrong. Some places really are different. What happened to me took place in the middle of winter when I was about 17 years old. At that time, I had just gotten my first pair of glasses because my eyesight was getting worse, but I wasn't used to wearing them all the time. Most days, I forgot them at home, so my vision was always a little blurry, especially if something was far away. I want to mention this first, because some people might think I was just seeing things. I had chosen nature photography for my senior school project, and since I lived near the woods outside Pisgah National Forest, I thought it would be the perfect place to get some good pictures. The forest was quiet in winter, with hardly anyone around, so it felt peaceful, but also a bit lonely, especially on cold days when the sky was gray and there was ice on the trees. I usually went out after school, carrying my camera, walking along the trails, looking for animals or something interesting. Even though I couldn't see everything clearly without my glasses, I was excited about my project. But that day, something happened that made me see the forest in a completely different way. I asked my mom if she could drive me into Pisgah so I could take some photos for my project. While we drove through the woods, even though it was winter and the trees had lost all their leaves, I still thought the forest looked beautiful in its own way. So I told my mom I wanted some pictures of the plants and trees. She pulled over at a spot where there was a trail I had used many times before. It was a place I knew well, so she let me out while she waited in the car. I started walking down the trail by myself, holding my camera and looking around for anything interesting. The path was easy to follow, and after a short walk through the bare trees, I came out onto the riverbank. In the summer, this spot was always full of people swimming and hanging out by the water, but now it was empty and cold. The river made a wide curve, and you could walk along the rocky shore for a little, while past the end of the trail. I thought it would be a good place to find something to photograph, so I kept going along the water's edge. I was wearing a bright orange raincoat that day, so anyone could have seen me from far away. As I walked along the river and took photos, I noticed an old railroad spike sticking up from the ground. I thought it would make an interesting picture, so I crouched down to get a good angle. While I was focused on my camera, I suddenly realized how quiet it had become. It was a heavy, uncomfortable silence, almost like everything had just stopped, for a moment. It felt like I was completely alone, with nothing moving around me at all. That's when I became very aware of myself, and how easy I was to see in my bright orange coat. I felt exposed, standing out in the open with nothing to hide behind. It was a strange feeling, like I was being watched even though I couldn't see anyone. I remember feeling a sudden wave of fear that I couldn't really explain. It was like my body just knew something wasn't right, and I wanted to hurry up and finish taking pictures so I could leave that spot. While I was sitting there with that strong, uneasy feeling, I suddenly heard the sound of footsteps crunching through the leaves and twigs on the ground. The sound came from the other side of the river. Because it was winter and all the trees were bare, I could see pretty far in every direction. There was nothing blocking my view, so I watched the opposite riverbank carefully, trying to see who or what was there. The footsteps sounded like a person moving closer to the edge of the water. I stared across the river, and then I saw something move between the trees. It was all gray, and it didn't look like a human, but it was tall and seemed to be walking upright on two legs. For a few seconds, I couldn't look away. I felt frozen in place, just watching it and trying to figure out what it was. I had never seen anything like that before, and it scared me in a way I can't really explain. It kept getting closer and closer, and right when it was almost at the riverbank, something inside me finally made me move. I turned around and ran, as fast as I could, not looking back even once. I don't think I've ever been that scared in my life. I just wanted to get back to the safety of my mom's car as quickly as possible. When I finally reached the car, I was out of breath, shaking, and almost couldn't talk. My mom saw my face and right away asked me what had happened. I tried to explain what I saw and how I suddenly felt really afraid. Then she told me that while I was walking on the trail, she suddenly got a strange, strong feeling that something was wrong. She said it felt like she needed to come find me right away, and she was just about to get out of the car when I came running back. We left right after that, and even now, my mom and I still talk about what happened that day. We never really figured out what I saw or what it could have been. Sometimes we try to come up with ideas, but nothing really makes sense. I've told my boyfriend the story, and he said maybe it was a skinwalker or some kind of animal. Part of me wishes I could have seen it more clearly, or maybe gotten a photo, but most of me is just glad I ran away when I did. The feeling I got was so strong. It still makes me uneasy when I remember it. Sometimes I think about how close it came to the river and wonder what would have happened if I stayed there longer, or if I hadn't noticed it at all. I haven't met anyone else who has seen something like that, but I do wonder if other people have had the same kind of experience, maybe even in the same area or in other forests. Every time I go back to the woods, I remember that day, and it always makes me a little more careful about where I go and what I pay attention to. This took place in 2010 when I went hiking with 4 friends deep into the Bridger-Teton National Forest. We were all fresh out of college and wanted one last real trip before starting work. It was me, Kyle, Luke, Tina, and Jen. We followed a nice trail for hours, then cut through a dense stretch of trees until we found a flat clearing beside a narrow creek. The spot was quiet and far enough from the main trails, but someone had already been there. Right at the edge of the clearing stood a weathered canvas tent. It was zipped shut, but the campfire ring looked used, but not recently. We talked about moving to a different spot, but we were tired, and the area was big enough to give them space if they returned. So we pitched our tents 50 feet away and kept to ourselves. That night, we cooked over our fire and stayed close. Then, around midnight, everyone went to sleep, except me. I sat by the fire, just watching the woods. That's when I noticed the flap on the other tent. It was moving, like someone inside was trying to peek out. A minute passed, then the flap stopped moving. I didn't wake anyone and went to bed, telling myself it was nothing. In the morning, we noticed Kyle was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots missing, but his backpack and phone were still in the tent. At first, we thought he'd gone to relieve himself or maybe walk down to the creek. So we waited, called his name a few times, checked the nearby trail and water, hoping he'd come back soon. But he never did. We didn't want to panic too early, but something felt off. Kyle wasn't the type to go far without saying anything. I couldn't stop looking at the old tent. The flap that had moved in the night was zipped up again, clean and straight, like no one had touched it. I walked over slowly, trying to listen for anything inside. I crouched and unzipped it. There were 2 sleeping bags still rolled halfway open, and nothing out of place. Jamal came up behind me, stood there without a word, and we both just stared for a few seconds before I zipped it closed again. We didn't mention what I saw last night. I wasn't even sure I'd really seen it, and with Kyle missing, the last thing we needed was more confusion. Sarah wanted to pack up right away, but we convinced her to give it until noon. If Kyle didn't come back by then, we'd leave and get help. Just after midday, Luke walked past the tree line behind the old tent. That's when he saw it. 3 short cuts in the bark of a pine tree. The marks on the tree didn't explain anything, but they changed the mood. We stopped talking, stopped trying to reason it out. By the time we packed our things, no one looked at the old tent. We just left it behind. About an hour into the hike back, we spotted someone sitting near the edge of a dry creek bed. It was Kyle. His face was pale, his hands dirty, and his boots were missing. When we reached him, he didn't say much. We asked where he'd gone, but he said he wasn't sure. He remembered waking up during the night, hearing something soft, moving past the tent, and then walking into the trees without thinking. He couldn't explain where he'd been or how he ended up by the creek. His socks were wet and torn, but there were no cuts or bruises, no signs of a fall. We walked together the rest of the way, not saying much, just focused on getting out of the forest. At the ranger station, we filed a report. We told them about the missing hours, the abandoned tent, and everything we could remember. They took it seriously and sent a team to check the area. 3 days later, they called us back, saying the team found nothing, not even the tree with the carvings. So we showed them our photos, but somehow the tent never appeared. Every picture ended just before the spot where it had stood. Kyle doesn't speak about it anymore. He says the memory feels distant, like something that happened to someone else. We never went back to Bridger Teton. Not because we were scared, but because whatever was out there didn't seem like it wanted to be found again. This happened last year. I had just turned 24 and wanted to do something different for my birthday. One of my close friends came to visit from out of town, and we planned a one-night camping trip. We picked a remote spot about 3 hours from where I live. We packed the night before and left early the next morning, around 3 a.m. The plan was to get there by sunrise, set up, and spend the day relaxing. The drive started out fine. The interstate was empty and the weather was clear. But everything shifted the moment we left the highway and turned onto the dirt road that led into the hills. It didn't happen gradually. It hit all at once. A sharp wave of pressure in my chest, like I had just stepped into something wrong. At first, I thought maybe it was anxiety or nerves, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like fear, but it wasn't coming from anything I could see or hear. Drove in silence for a long time, and neither of us said anything. I think we were both waiting for the other to break the silence first. Then, about 20 minutes in, my friend spoke. He kept his eyes on the road and said he had felt something too. Said he didn't want to bring it up but couldn't shake it anymore. I told him I felt the same, but I didn't explain it. I didn't have the words for it. By the time we reached the campsite turnoff, we didn't stop. We didn't even slow down. We just kept driving until we reached the next town, parked in a lot, and sat there waiting for the sun to come up. As the sky started to lighten, that heavy feeling began to fade, and by the time morning settled in, it was gone. Everything felt normal again. That's when he told me what he'd seen during the drive. He said he kept noticing people standing by the side of the road, not moving, not doing anything, just standing still. A few near the trees, some only a few feet from the edge of the dirt. He saw them more than once. He hadn't said anything at the time because he didn't want to make things worse or sound crazy. I didn't see anything. But every time the fear came, I caught this strong smell of smoke. We ate breakfast at the diner and tried to reason it out. Maybe we were tired. Maybe the forest was playing tricks. Maybe it was just a bad stretch of road. It was easy to believe that when the sun was out, eventually we decided to go back. We still wanted the trip, and we had the truck, so if anything felt wrong again, we could leave. By the time we returned, it was late afternoon. The place looked normal. We parked and stayed near the truck, walked around a little and ate something. When the lights started to fade, we got into the truck, locked the doors, and leaned back in the seats. Neither of us mentioned setting up camp. It didn't need to be said. The night came fast, and the sky was pitch black. Then, it was past midnight when I started hearing something. I wasn't sure at first, but after a while, I realized it sounded like a group of people having a conversation somewhere out in the woods. I opened my eyes and saw that my friend was already awake. He didn't say anything, and neither did I. The voices didn't move closer or fade away. I couldn't make out any words, but it didn't feel like an echo or anything natural. Then, suddenly, it all stopped, and everything went completely quiet. Again, that's when we heard it, a single scream, like someone let it out in a second and then completely disappeared. It came from somewhere out in the woods, and after that, nothing. I stayed awake for a while, but eventually, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the sky was starting to lighten and everything looked normal again. We didn't talk, just started getting ready to leave. While driving back down the dirt road, I caught the smell again. It was faint and didn't last long. Once we reached the highway, it was like nothing had happened. We stopped in the next town for gas, then drove the rest of the way home without saying much. Later, I read about that area. There had been a sad event on that land a long time ago, involving a group of native people. Some say strange things still happen out there. I don't know what we experienced. I don't think it wanted anything from us. But I don't think it wanted us to stay either. This happened in early February 2022. I had just started working part-time at a small movie theater in northern Illinois. I was 20, living with my cousin while saving up for school. The job wasn't much, just closing shift work. On my 5th or 6th night, I started noticing something strange in screen 2. Under seat E4, there were always the same things left behind: an empty water bottle, candy wrappers, sometimes a napkin or a crumpled ticket stub. No other seats had trash, just that one, at me. First, I assumed someone had switched seats during the movie. But after it happened several nights in a row, it didn't make sense, so I checked the seating charts out of curiosity. Row E hadn't been booked at all that week. I told the manager about it. He said people move around sometimes, but I had been checking the rows before and after the screenings, and no one else had left anything behind. I didn't bring it up again. I just kept checking that row each night. I wanted to see if it would happen again. Almost every other day, I found the same kind of trash under that seat. I started checking the auditorium before the screening began, and again after everyone left. Most nights, row E stayed completely empty. On a Thursday night, I cleaned the seat before the movie and watched the entire show from the back of the auditorium. Screen 2 was running the final show of the night. After the screening began, I moved on to other tasks. The building was quiet by then. A few customers, all scattered. Nothing drew attention. Once the show ended, I waited near the exit corridor. People came out slowly, most heading straight for the lobby doors. One man stepped into the restroom across the hall. He had been sitting near the front. I didn't think much of it. 10 minutes passed. No one else came out. Screen 2 wasn't touched after that. The door was pulled closed. The next day, when I came in, the opener mentioned trash found under one seat. There was nothing to report officially, but it kept happening almost every day. The door sensors hadn't gone off. The cameras hadn't flagged anything. Yet someone had been inside again. So I stayed late again. Screen 2 had the last show. I checked the rows before the movie started and stayed out of sight near the hallway. Once it ended, the man in row A stood up as the credits rolled, walked out with the others, and stepped into the restroom across from the screening rooms. This time, I waited longer than usual. After some time, he came out. He didn't see me. Maybe he thought the building was empty. I watched him walk straight to screen 2, then take something from his pocket and unlock the door. Now, I had no idea how he got the key, but I didn't wait to find out. I called the police. 2 officers with flashlights entered, walked to row E and spoke to him. He didn't resist or say much, just stood up and followed instructions. They escorted him out without any issue. They said he had likely been entering and hiding for weeks. Nothing was damaged or stolen. E4 hasn't had a single piece of trash under it since, but I still look at it every night before I go. In June 2021, I was working a tree planting contract near Smithers, British Columbia. Our camp was deep in the forest, probably an hour and a half up rough mountain roads. Now, it was the kind of isolation that feels normal when you're working. Those kinds of jobs, until something reminds you how far from help you really are. We all slept in tents. Mine was set up near a group of tall, dry trees. I was lying down, eyes closed, just trying to fall asleep, when I heard something. Sticks snapping. It was distant at first, then another crack, closer this time. I listened harder and realized the sound was moving. 10 minutes passed, then another 5. Then it sounded like it stopped maybe 15 feet from my tent. I didn't want to unzip the tent or even sit up, so I just shouted loud, hoping to scare it off. What followed was complete silence, and that silence stayed. I listened as hard as I could, but it was like whatever had been there was gone. Then the sound came, something I still can't explain. I stayed frozen, waiting for it to move, expecting footsteps or branches snapping. But nothing happened. The silence just dragged on way longer than it should have. After maybe 20 minutes, I heard something else, and that's when it got worse. It sounded like one of the trees creaking, but something was off. I'd heard those same trees all week, and they never sounded like this. Usually the wind would push through, and you'd hear a slow groan that came and went, but this one didn't move. It started and then held the same exact pitch for 5 or 6 seconds straight, like someone took the beginning of a creak and stretched it. Then it just cut off, like someone hit a switch. That's what made it feel wrong. I sat up in my tent, staring ahead, waiting for something else, but nothing happened. I didn't say anything to the others. A few weeks later, I came across a story online about skinwalkers and how they copy sounds but never perfectly. And the second I read that, my mind went straight back to that night. Thought about telling someone, but every time I tried, I stopped before the words came out. It wasn't like a normal story, and it didn't feel right calling it just a noise or just a weird night.